human rights is often said to be a bit of a secular religion because it's saying that certain things are almost like a priori. They just arise from human existence as basic principles. They're not torturing, not murdering, those sorts of things. They're so obvious that they are actually, and there must be something which is not contingent on any particular society. They're across societies. And there's trying to identify those commonalities, which I don't think they're a priori and I don't think they're unchanging. But I think that's an appropriate way of deciding what your basic principles are. It's a good way. The more you look to different societies, the more you might justify the fact that, yes, do not kill is actually something which every society pretty much applies. And like the neighbor principle is pretty common, across all societies. So why not have those as universal? But whether it's God or human rights or something, I think it can work in lots of different ways. I don't think one is better or worse. It depends on the society.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Big Questions of Jewish Belief, with me, Rabbi Dr. Rabbi Zarum from London School of Jewish Studies. In this series, I'm interviewing some really interesting people about their personal views of belief and God. And this time I have with me, very happily, Adam Wagner KC. Adam, it's wonderful to see you.
It's really lovely to be here. It's an honor for me as well.
Thank you. Adam has done some amazing things in the United Kingdom for the General Society and for the Jewish community. I'll just briefly explain and then we'll get right into Adam. Adam is a leading human rights barrister. He's an expert on COVID laws. And during COVID, in fact, he was the kind of call-up person on trying to interpret the changing laws in our government and the worries of the lack of checking of what was going on in what he called an emergency state, which he published in a book in 2022, which is a great read. And more connected to the Jewish community, Adam has been representing families of the hostages when they were in Gaza with their UK connections and did some amazing things in terms of bringing them this country. Adam, when you brought Eli Sharabi to meet the Prime Minister Keir Starmer and making known the issue more wider in public was a wonderful thing that you did. And in my personal feeling, a Kiddush Hashem, a sanctification of God's name. So you've done some amazing things and you're a great person. And I wanted to talk to you about your beliefs about God. Now, it's very personal, but you've agreed to talk about it. So let me go straight in. What's your earliest memory of faith as a child and in the way you were brought up? Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so I was brought up in Manchester. I was brought up in a sort of what you probably think of as a standard United Synagogue family, although we weren't, Manchester didn't have the United Synagogue at the time. So we were Orthodox. I would go to shul every week, particularly because my mother's father was a very keen shul attender, so I'd always go with him. We were part of a minyan, which was associated with Hale Shul in Bowden, but it wasn't a formal setup. So if you went early enough, you would set up the shul. There was a locked cupboard in a community centre where you'd get the mechitza out and the kiddush and the ark, and you set it all up. And then at the end of shul, you put it all back in the cupboard. So it was very much a kind of knit your own community. And we didn't have a formal rabbi either. But that was a lovely environment to grow up in. And I really enjoyed going to shul, and being with my friends and sort of, in that sort of small environment.
So you prayed. Were you thinking about God at that point? Were you conscious of it? How did you look at God when you were a child?
God was kind of like it was a bit like the fish in the water. The God was the water around me. I never really thought to challenge the idea of God. That's God just was, and and we did what we did because of God. And that was, I went to Cheder, twice a week and did my bar mitzvah and all of that. And it just never really, I didn't think about it very carefully at all. I just sort of did the sort of standard things that you do as a child. It's probably only later in my sort of teenage years and 20s that I actually sort of sat down and gave it any real thoughts.
I think that's a very good point. And a lot of people, I think a lot of us brought up traditionally, that is the case. I like that metaphor of it's the water around in which we live. It just is. We go along with it. Synagogue is meaningful for lots of other reasons, and friends and food and family. And then when you get older, you start questioning. So tell us about then. How did you begin to change your views on faith?
Yes. So the other big influence on me Jewishly as a teenager and a young adult was Habonim, the youth movement. I was
Right.
very, very involved in Habonim. In fact, I was the Mazkir of Habonim when I left university. I was a leader on camps, and that it was just a huge part of my life. And Habonim is a very sort of secular, culturally Jewish movement. And what happened, I think, was when I got to I worked for Habonim, then I went to study in the States, and I came back to London and I went to law school. And at that point, I realized that my kind of my Jewish education and, all of my Jewish knowledge had sort of frozen slightly at my bar mitzvah, probably. And I'd stopped formally learning about Jewish things. And it's then I'd very much got into this cultural Jewish world, but the cultural Jewish world wasn't offering. There was no cultural Jewish shul that I could join. I was away from my family. My family were all in Manchester. So in actual fact, I started, and I hope you like this, but I went to Limud for the first time when I was, I guess, in my mid-20s, because I'd always had one in winter camp. So I'd never even never had the opportunity to go to Limud. And I remember seeing you, and I saw Lindsay Taylor Goodhart's and a few of the other LSJS type educators, and I decided that really sort of engaged me, and I decided to do some LSJS courses. So I did the year-long Tanakh course, I did the year-long Tefillah course, did a few other little ones, and the idea was I was trying to kind of retrain myself. Like I thought I don't want to just sort of reflexively go into join a shul. I wanted to join a shul. I didn't want to reflexively join a shul without I wanted it to be an active adult choice rather than it being kind of just, this is the way I was brought up and therefore I'm going to do exactly the same, because I wasn't necessarily really feeling that. And I felt, I guess I had a bit of a free pass because I didn't have my family in London. So I didn't have to go to any particular shul. So I thought, well, I'll educate myself, which I tried to do, from the basics. And when I came out of that, I met Julia around that time, and she was also doing a sort of similar thing at the JLE. And we kind of met in the middle. She'd maybe grown up a little bit more religious, and we kind of met somewhere in the middle. And we joined an Orthodox shul. And then eventually, after 5 years, after our daughter was born, we moved to New North London because we wanted a more egalitarian community. And in amongst all that, I had to sort of like face up to what I believed and what I wanted in my life, which I guess is just being part of growing up.
Right. It's a great story about how you've gone there. And I forgot the LSJS connection, but of course, that's great. We all go in different directions. And so you're in shul every week. You've got your siddur open. You're praying. God's all over the text. You've said you've got different views. So what do you think about when you're praying? Do you understand Hashem as a creator, or is directly involved in your life, or helping you care for your children? What goes through your head? If it does, I'd love to hear.
So I'm a huge believer in Judaism. As a way of living my life. Like it's huge. It's just hugely important to me. It always has been in different contexts. I've got a very strong Jewish identity. I feel like being Jewish in the UK gives you certain responsibilities, which I take really seriously. And I enjoy going to shul. And sometimes I don't even know why I enjoy praying as well. I enjoy singing, even though I'm not a very good singer. I run the children's service, which I've been doing for 15 years, which I really like doing now. I do it with my daughter. What goes through my head? I'm not even sure I know. I'm very skeptical about the existence of God. For me, it seems like not a rational, belief. So, I've played with the idea of, well, maybe I believe in a kind of presence and something connecting us all and that sort of thing. But I actually don't. I don't believe in that either. I think it's more of a kind of the ethics and the traditions and the sort of ethnic community that we're part of is the thing. And I'm happy to live with the conflict. I can see it as a conflict. I can see it as a bit hypocritical. But I don't mind it. I feel like, in a way, that's also part of being Jewish.
I love you say it in that kind of way. So you're a rationalist, you're skeptical about God, and even this idea of some kind of presence, which people talk about as well, you have difficulty with that. Why do you have difficulty with that? Is it because of your rationalism and you can't see it, observe it, or you just doubt? that's the case.
Because for there to be a kind of presence, it would have to be something metaphysical, I think, or something like kind of avatar type, like some sort of electrical current that runs through everything, which has itself a sort of consciousness that drives things a bit. I don't see any evidence of that. I feel like emotionally, I might feel that there's sometimes in life you feel that things are happening that are strange or meant to be or vindictive, that fate is vindictive against you. And I just don't, I'm much more, for me, it's what's much more important in my life is what I do,
Right.
and what other people do. And I feel like anything that takes away that agency is problematic for me.
Okay. So the agency aspect of it. But let me ask you, Julia is a wonderful person, your partner, and you've got lovely kids, and you love Julia. And if I said to you, is your love for your wife and your children real? You would say, I'm just trying this out. You would say, yes, it's real, right? It exists. But there's no way of measuring it. There's no way of proving it, right? We could give all other explanations of why you're doing it based on biology and reproduction and genetics and comfort and community. And yet you would say that you are in love and you have love, and that's a real thing. And some people look at God in that kind of way. And the truth of relationship, of relational existence, is the nature of God.
Yeah, that may be right. I mean, I actually remember, go back to LSJS just to keep things on the right
Thank you.
I remember I did a Jewish philosophy course with Tamra Wright.
Right.
And she talked about Levinas and the relational stuff and the face-to-face. And Julia and I think, did that together. We talk about that sometimes. And I completely see that. That there's all sorts of reasons why one could reasonably justify having different interpretations of what God is. And this is why I feel a bit like uncomfortable saying I'm an atheist, although I think I probably am an atheist, because I feel like the sort of Richard Dawkins style militant atheism has really taken over that idea, and the podcasters.
I think it's become quite unnecessarily aggressive. I see what you're saying.
And actually, I feel like I don't want to impose my interpretation of my beliefs on anybody. I don't think it really matters. I think what really matters is how people behave.
Yes, and I want to focus on that. I want to get into that. But just one thing, you want to push on other people, but how about your children? And you run the children's service. So you must talk about Hashem somehow in the children's service. Surely.
I do, and sometimes I say it in one way, and sometimes I say it in the other, and sometimes I catch myself. And I'll try and, in some of the books that I'll read, I've got all the PJ Library books, which we keep as a resource for the children's services. And some of them are more godlike, and some of them are more sort of, secular focused, I'd say. And I don't mind, because I feel like it's up to them. In the same way my parents never imposed on me beliefs. And I'm quite, I remember I used to, at some points in my Habonim world, I used to be a bit jealous of some of the kids who used to go to protests with their parents. Their parents, the family all seemed to have the same beliefs about everything. And it was really sort of, that to me seemed really, really fun to live in that kind of environment. But actually, looking back on my childhood, I'm really grateful to my parents for not imposing beliefs on me, because it's given me the ability to think things through and to change my mind, and not feel like that's the kind of, like, that's going to affect my relationship with my family. And I'd like to think for my kids, it's the same. What I think is actually really important is to give them a positive experience of growing up Jewish.
But when they ask questions, have they asked questions, or when they ask questions?
I'm totally honest. I say, this is my belief.
Right.
I don't say it in the absolute, as in this is the case. About that, when we talk about ethics, like I might be a bit more directive. No, you don't do that to people. It's wrong to do that to people, because I feel more confident doing that. I don't feel confident saying to them, there is no God, or there is a God, or you must do this because of this. I'm much more bothered about how they behave, and giving them a sort of love of Jewish life, like I was given a love of Jewish life, which I think they're getting, and which is much more about giving them the right access to the right communities, youth movements, a good bar and bat mitzvah, which we're going through at the moment. All of that, I think those fundamentals are much more important than imposing a particular belief system.
I can see that. And giving them space also allows them to discuss it with you and not feel or if I don't feel this, then I can't talk to my parents about it. And you're giving them that space, and you're seeing interesting as kind of personal, that it's their choice how they do it, but then you're still encouraging Jewish life and the rituals, which you would think, prayer, synagogue, you have to believe. But I agree with you, not necessarily. There are many people who like this style and believe it on some kind of way. But I want to move into your legal aspects, because I think that's interesting for me. Your belief in the law. You got this honorary doctorate from the University of Law recently, which is a wonderful thing and well-deserved. And you talked in your speech, which I listened to, about the values of law, of equity, of justice, of equality, and fairness in the law. And as you know, Judaism is a law-based faith, right? Halakha, following these laws is really a powerful thing. That relationship. English judges don't dance with the law books, and yet us on Simchat Torah dance with our Sefer Torah. Have you reflected on the way, and because you've dedicated your life to the law and defending and helping people in a very passionate, intense way and in a great way. Have you reflected on the way you look at Jewish law and differences, similarities, or in your head are they very separate things?
They're not separate. They're different legal systems that have, different interpretative principles and different procedural rules. But they are recognizably the same kind of thing. I know a lot less about Jewish law and halakha than I know about English law, but I can see when it's funny because during COVID, I had an unusual amount of, I don't know, what's the right word, insight into Jewish aspects of this, of what was going on, partly because I was advising certain people on things to do that were happening in Jewish communities, and had to understand what the difference is and how, and also what the relationship, one of the things that's really important in English law is about conflicts of laws, is like, when there are different legal systems in play, how do you resolve? My dad, who's a solicitor, his business partner for decades was from, and they did a lot of work in the Manchester Orthodox Jewish community. And quite a lot of the time you would be dealing with disputes that had been, where a contractual dispute where the Beth Din was assigned as the kind of arbitrator of the contract. So then you would have a Beth Din ruling, and then you would have to go to the High Court to decide whether that was appropriate, and etc. And it's really interesting, but it's not. It's for me, like the ethical side of things is really important as well. And I can see. I used to do sessions on Limud for a few years about how Jewish are human rights. So what connections are there between Jewish law and human rights law? And there are definitely certain compatibilities, and the law arising from the Torah and the halakha is definitely, in a way, a precursor to some of the really important principles that are in English law and human rights law. It kind of stops at the point of universality. That's where the difficulties or the differences arise.
So you're talking about universality in application.
Yeah.
Because the principle of equality for us, is we're all in the image of God. That is a universal idea in Judaism, and therefore everybody should be treated equally before the law. But you're saying the difference is we only apply Jewish law, we apply it differently to Jews and non-Jews.
Yeah, exactly. Jewish law is not in the same way we only apply English law to people in this country. Mm-hmm. It's a limited legal system. Human rights is meant to be an overarching set of principles.
So that's interesting. Now I want to get into that stuff. So, and this country has had difficulties with that, universal human rights, and this country having its right to do it separately. So in your idea, and this then relates to the Jewish aspect, do you see human rights as beyond a particular country or faith's legal system, as something fundamental to being human? And if that's the case, how does that relate to your faith, which is about being human? And
two big questions.
Yes.
I guess that the answer to the first question is yes, that the idea of human rights is, if you look back to, and I've also done quite a bit of teaching about the origins of human rights in the Holocaust and the absolute, you can look at the Human Rights Convention, particularly the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as a mirror image of what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust. As in all the things that were taken away from them, the right to work, the right to have a family, the right to life, the right not to be tortured. Those were all of the things that were made into sort of these universal rights. They were reflected. And the timing of it is exactly from, there are obviously precursors to human rights laws going back centuries, even millennia, going back to Cyrus the Great and the Torah and all of these things. But the idea, what the big change that happened after the Second World War was this. It was trying to take away the idea that individual countries with their individual legal systems could do more or less what they wanted to do their citizens if it was the law of the land. And that was seen to have failed because of the Holocaust and because of, but also, also the war, the two world wars. This idea of aggressive war and just going out and conquering for resources and doing whatever you want and killing lots of people as a result. All of if you look at the conventions that now so criticized, but came out of the late 1940s, early 1950s, you had the Genocide Convention, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Refugee Convention, and then the European Convention on Human Rights, which was a kind of like emerged from the Universal Declaration. All of the history of that is all, and in fact, the World Health Organization as well was part of that picture. It was all emerged at the same time, and it was meant to be from the people who lived through the Second World War. It was meant to be a way of dealing with some of the problems that had happened actually in the 30s. I think it was really about what happened in the 30s that they were dealing with. How do you stop it at the source rather than, because by the time you get to 1939, 1940, it's too late. How do you stop it arising? And this idea is to create early warning systems and also to try and impose through international agreements sets of basic principles which wouldn't replace national laws and it wouldn't replace religion, but it would give essentially the world saying these are the basics that everybody needs to comply with as a starting point. And then after that, you do what you want.
Yes. Thank you for the explanation. It makes it really clear and I really value it and agree. What's interesting is how it's turned out today, because countries are choosing to say, well, we don't want to follow. Well, on one hand, you could argue countries are following. We don't want to follow some of these. Britain had some issues with that. So pulling away from it, there isn't that universal agreement. And second of all, some have argued that instead of just concentrating on some of the basics, these universal principles are now being expanded and making demands on countries that they feel uncomfortable with. And that's why it's also being challenged. So is what they planned in their 50s and 60s working? Or we have to take a different direction now?
I think the idea of having basic universal standards for societies is the right one. I think it's wrong to see each country as an island where they can sort of go their own way. I think it's right to say things like democracy, liberal values, protection of minorities, protection of vulnerable groups, not torturing people, not killing people, all of those things. I think those basics are right.
Obviously, I agree with you, but a country's got a right to do what it does to its people. Once you try and go universal, you're touching on fundamental principles of being human, and we haven't agreed on those. Even democracy, in the way you described it, is not agreed by all countries or all peoples. And to impose it on others isn't, a shared agreement. If people all had agreed principles, then we could, discuss them. But if they don't, then the conversation has to be had. It isn't agreement. So we can't do it. No? And it's unfair to impose it because the country goes, well, I don't agree.
So I don't think you can impose it. I think we've basically learned that lesson, or maybe we haven't learned that lesson, but I think that was the kind of liberal interventionism. When I was at law school, that was the kind of big question about whether you could invade countries to impose democracy. And it hasn't worked out 20 years later. It just, it hasn't. So I agree with that. I do think there is quite a large section of the world which does basically agree with what the basic things should be. And there is a large section of the world that disagrees. And the like all big values, and in the end, you've got to trust that people will choose the one that leads to the most successful societies. So, like a bit like capitalism versus communism, in which was the big value debate for 70 years. And it's kind of, it's much less so now because it's sort of seen that communism was not a great way to run societies, not by everyone, but I think people can I mean, as interestingly, communist states were very into the idea of human rights. As you know, they talked a lot about human rights. They just didn't do human rights very successfully. I mean, Saudi Arabia has a really progressive constitution, but it makes no difference because it's not a progressive society.
So let me make a suggestion, because I think a liberal interventionism, I think exactly, it was the plan and the ideal, and it's cracking because there's many countries that don't see themselves as liberal. And I want to suggest or discuss something, because I'm not sure myself, but about religious humanism, which I think is a different approach. And this is where God comes back in as well. Because over half the world today, I would argue, about half the world, if we include Islam and Christianity and even parts of Hinduism, which are monotheistic, about half the planet, maybe more, subscribes, whether they're religious or not is different, but subscribes to a kind of monotheism, a belief in God. And even though we might disagree as humans on the basic principles, if we can agree on God as a guarantor of our morality, that is a different basis for conversation. So in the Torah, many times when it talks, it has the ethical verses, it will often end with the verse, Ani Hashem, and I'm God. And Rashi in the commentaries there say, I'm God, I'm watching. In other words, I'm the guarantor of this. And even in America today, which is a separation of church and state, the way they guarantee their currency is God. Since the 50s, they print on every dollar denominational bill, in God we trust. God is the guarantor, or the idea of God, of their currency. I will be trustworthy and pay you because of some idea of God. And maybe it's ironic, and that's why I use the word religious humanism, because human rights places the center on humans having rights as being in themselves human. But people disagree on what those rights should be. But if we think about something which is above human, some idea of God, and I often like saying on this broadcast, you can spell God with 2 O's, you believe in good, or principles that are above humans that we all have to subscribe to. Religious humanism might be a language, definitely with places like Saudi Arabia and others, that could work on doing human rights because we are all in the image of God, because we are all God's children. We have to be caring and understanding of each other and work in that kind of way. Now, liberals are going to go crazy with that language because it's like, why are you bringing God into this? Tony Blair famously says we don't do God. But it's a different way of looking at it, and it encourages not just governmental accountability, but individual responsibility. And this is where it's interesting. And, Gordon Brown, partly influenced by Rabbi Sachs, was interested in creating a bit of rights and responsibilities for this country. That we see ourselves as not just having rights as humans, but responsibilities to each other. So rights talks from the point of view of defending us, that I have these rights as a human being. But the religious language and the religious way of looking at it is we all have human responsibilities. We all have to care for each other equally. It's not a different system. It's a different perspective on a similar system. And for me, and I wish Rabbi Sachs was here to explain it better, but this religious humanism direction might be a way, I believe, or I hope, to get back to those universal human or right to responsibilities that the globe desperately needs today. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So like a few things. First of all, I think what you're describing is what religion was about, or as an ethical set of principles. I don't think you need to be a Richard Dawkins subscriber to see, like, quite obviously, sociologically, the power of monotheistic religion based around a moral code was to say exactly that to people, is to say, yes, you've got all of your concerns about, how many cows you own and the cow that got knocked over on the street by someone, who's going to pay for it. These are all really important. Your warring tribal, rivalries with other families. But there are actually, God wants you, God, who we all believe in and we can all agree with. And by the way, don't mess with God, because you can't, because he's all powerful, has actually set out, and he's given us, written down, some basic principles which should apply to all of those things. And actually, we've interpreted those into more detailed coded laws for our society. And in the end, we're going to have, although a lot of this is between humans, we're going to keep these basic principles. And then that allowed people to have this sort of dual, which I think is just basic, like really good human psychology, this dual vision of seeing things, and what will it do for me, and seeing things in a wider ethical perspective, and trying to, and obviously it doesn't always work, but it's a good way of setting up a society because it has overall principles, and it also has like basic laws. And lots of societies are set up in that way that don't have God. So I think that's what the US Constitution is. That's what constitutions are. They're a direct descendant of religious codes. That they are the same thing. But if you really go into I'm sure you read the historians that talk about the structure of certain parts of the Old Testament are very similar to kind of contractual structures at the time that the Jewish people were engaged in. God, oh masterful and almighty, who's done all these great things. This is what we call it in the law, would be a recital in a court order. You have upon this and upon that and upon this, we agree to do, and if we don't, this is what's going to happen. And that's the kind of, it's a really good contractual structure, and it doesn't, and it's important. Belief in God is important in that setting because there's a trust element that if you don't worry, we're going to punish you if you don't. We're going to chop your head off or whatever we're going to do if you don't comply with it. But there's an ultimate judge who you really need to be worried about because that's much worse. You can have that as with God at the center, or like with the banknotes. You may say, "Oh yeah," and God. I remember my Lubavitch, the Lubavitch rabbi in my area had a huge poster of that, "In God We Trust," and it said under it said, "It's on the money." That was it was obviously
like
a Chabad type kind of poster. But I think bringing that onto human rights as an idea and this religious humanism, human rights is a kind of religious, it's often said to be a bit of a secular religion because it's saying that certain things are almost like a priori. They are part of human. They just arise from human existence as basic principles. That not torturing, not murdering, those sorts of things. They're so obvious that they must be something which is not contingent on any particular society. They're across societies, and it's trying to identify those commonalities, which I think is, I don't think they're a priori and I don't think they're unchanging. But I think that's an appropriate way of deciding what your basic principles are. It's a good way, and the more you look to different societies, the more you might justify the fact that yes, do not kill is actually something which every society pretty much applies. And like the neighbor principle is pretty common across all societies. So why not have those as universal? But whether it's God or human rights or something, I think it can work in lots of different ways. I don't think one is better or worse. It depends on the society.
I'm with you there, and the history of it and how it evolved and the differences are really well taken. But maybe for me, what I'm asking is the language of God or religious humanism, which is what we're talking about here, talks about responsibilities as opposed to rights. Now, you could just argue logically they're the two sides of the same coin. If I have rights, then society has responsibilities. But what I'm saying is that society has responsibilities. That's what Billy Bragg, when I interviewed him, called accountability. And he said accountability is what the state has to be accountable and also to make sure that we all have these rights. But when you call it a responsibility, which is God, which is personal, and we talked about God at the beginning, you talked about this personal thing, it makes it more personal, individualized.
I agree.
And my question then is, in liberal societies today, is it possible to have responsibilities, or just the way liberal law is structured, secular law, you can't make people responsible to do certain things? In certain countries, we have you can't stand idly by. If someone is in trouble, you don't help them, you can be prosecuted. But could it be, I'm just asking, could we build in responsibilities and have that language in the current way law exists for human rights? Would that be helpful? Because for me, that's religion coming in, the religious ideas, without necessarily being called gods, but these values.
Yeah, I don't think making responsibilities legal requirements is the best way of doing that. And I think if you go back to the beginning, like why am I so involved in my synagogue? Why do I go to synagogue every week? Why am I really eating for my children to grow up in that environment? Because I feel like that those sorts of like communities of meaning or communities of the tradition are much better transfers of the ideas of responsibilities. Like, if I look at my career, like why I've chosen the things I've chosen, is it because the law required me to be a good person or want to be a good person. Of course not. It was to do with, I would say, the two big reasons are my upbringing and seeing the way my family were engaged in the local community, and my youth movement, which was absolutely central to my value system, which was all about, like, Habonim is all about going out into the world and trying to make it a better place, which is, I think, what all Jewish youth movements are actually. You have the power to go and do that. You don't let anybody tell you. Don't let the adults tell you that things can't change. You go out and find the right thing to do, and just do it, and just try it. That all of that is, I think, is incredibly valuable, and something that you can't force on people. You have to you have to show them by example and by experience, and I think religion does that a lot better than law or other kind of other social institutions. Like, religion's really good at that. I'm sure that there's lots of other institutions, whether it's the Scouts or those kind of community institutions that do similar things. But I think religion is, I don't know, all my experience of religion is it builds an ethical kind of behavior.
Yes, I see what you're saying. And again, it's an issue of Rabbi Sachs. He would talk about, we're voters, we're consumers, we're also human beings. The third sector, communal institutions, right? Whether it's the Scouts or religious faith and so on, is the place for this. And I agree. It was just, I was wondering if the legal system, since it is built on religious ideas, if a language of responsibilities might make people look at it differently, because the liberalist ethic always seems to be, don't harm others, but then you'll be left to do what you want. Since we teach our children to be responsible, there's things you should do, why doesn't we think, not force people in the state to do it, but have a culture of education, even if it's language within law, which encourages responsibility? Because human rights, and you're very passionate about this, and you should be, and I believe in it, but for me, the word rights always seems to be about individual right and human, as opposed to the responsibilities that I've got to give society. As Kennedy said, don't just ask not what your country could do for you, what could do for your country. But this idea, I just think if we had responsibilities language, it might be helpful with rights in a way, and make people feel that they're responsible for it. In your book, Emergency State, you talk about how people look sometimes in very negative ways about these rights because of the way that the government talked about it during COVID. And I agree with you, it should be something we're proud of. But I think we'd feel personally more connected to it if we sometimes use the language of responsibilities and not rights.
Yeah, and actually, it's not as stark as people think. There is a lot of talk about responsibilities in the way the laws apply. So, for example, I do a lot of work in protest law, and the idea of freedom of speech in human rights law, which is very important in our law, is not absolute. It's based on you comply with certain requirements. You're peaceful. You are. You don't abuse people. You listen to the authorities if they've got a reasonable requirement for you. But once you cross a line into criminal damage or into abusing people or to using violence, then you lose your rights. And the courts often talk about responsibilities, like judges. Yeah, judges like to, especially in the criminal law, they like to talk about you have a responsibility to do X, Y, and Z. If someone's in a position of responsibility and they like their teacher and they sexually assault their student, the law comes down on them like a ton of bricks because they've abused their position of responsibility. But I'm not sure whether it's really the right vehicle for responsibility. I think I completely agree. Education is, like, schools are obviously somewhere where responsibility should be taught, and we shouldn't focus too much on I think that the mistake in my world, in the human rights world, is assuming that everything is a human rights issue. Whereas because if you think only through the lens, it's that idea of if you're a hammer, everything's a nail to you. And it's the same with human rights. If you think of everything about rights, then you lose like a really important part of human responsibility. I completely agree with that. But I would say that human rights are a kind of last-ditch protective shield against the state when it goes too far. Like that's really what they were designed to do. And absolutely, they've been taken further than they were designed by certain groups. They've been misinterpreted. They've been seen as something which is, just a weapon against particular groups. all of that, because it's a big, complex concept which applies to every, which has been applied to a lot of people in the world. So people have taken it in different directions. But I think what you're saying, what I'm saying, are not incompatible at all.
I think that's really helpful to see in that way. And I think you made that divide clear. And I've never thought about it actually to look at judges' statements and actually to see how the language of responsibility is expressed when they're talking about these issues and why that's valuable. And I need to think more about that and maybe read up more about that to see it. That's a language that I can really relate to and build in. And that's why, for me, it feels like religion and Torah and go to synagogue and shul is important to you, because it's something beyond the rights in this kind of this responsibility of being part of a community that you really value. So we have to come towards an end, but just so final question, when you're praying and maybe not thinking about God as this independent individual, which is actually more of a Christian idea for the Jews, it's interesting the way you describe it. There's Martin Buber talks about this. God was like the context in which the story of the Jewish people evolved, and that's how we relate to Hashem. But when you're praying, do you see your passionate ethics and your human rights coming into the texts and marry the two together? When you're praying, do you think about these wonderful things you did for hostages and the legal things? Do you kind of thank or bless about it on Shabbat, or is it a separate thing for you? I'm just, I know I'm getting to your head, but I'm just fascinated by these things. So just as a final thing, do they come together?
The last 2.5 years since 7th of October 2023, my work life and my religious life and my social life have become much more intertwined than they usually are. Usually I go to shul and it can be a way of getting away from the stuff I'm doing during the week. But the being so involved, Adam Rose and I were representing 7 families of British linked hostages, of 10 hostages, and very often it would be the big topic of conversation in shul. It would be, we would do the hostages prayer, the Achenu, and then by, like the flip side of that is, we did an event at Downing Street last year, which Adam and I made the government do, which was a sort of memorial event for the 7th of October, but also it was Emily Damari's mother, and Mandy spoke, and Steve Brisley, and the Prime Minister hosted it, and they did the Achenu prayer there. And the chief rabbi led the Achenu prayer. So we stood in Downing Street doing the Achenu prayer with the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary and all these pieces. So it's kind of this bizarre, like, fusing of these two parts of my life, which have never been completely separate, but I've tried to keep them a bit separate. So, and then I would, it would really, there's lots of we became very close to these families. Like, you can't just maintain a sort of professional, we are your lawyers separation in this situation. It's impossible. You have to have a heart of stone for that to happen. And certain things would hit us, emotionally differently, Adam and I. And I remember, the thing that really got to me when Eli Sharabi came to speak at the St. John's Wood Synagogue. And it was the first time I'd heard, although it wasn't the first time I'd met him, because we took him to see the Prime Minister the day before, and we'd done sort of, we'd had a private meeting with him. But he spoke, one of the first things he spoke about was saying the Shema. And when I think he was speaking about saying the Shema either when he was taken or each day, I think maybe both. And he spoke about their observance of festivals, which a lot of hostages spoke about. While they were in it. But I think his thing was that they had Friday night prayers every week, and they would keep an extra piece of pita bread as the second challah portion, which for them was like, it was almost impossible because they were starving. But they kept this little sort of quarter of the pita bread. And that for me, it's just incredibly moving. And if you talk about this kind of, what's this extra emotional or extra godlike feeling, like that for me is too much to process as a rational person. Like what I feel about those things and how it felt to be part of that. We had an ongoing joke that whenever we brought over families for delegations, I would always be in charge of the food. Because first of all, because we had some religious families who I knew obviously would not be able to eat at all. We were taking them from the Foreign Office to Downing Street and to all sorts of places. Like they had to have good food. And I knew that as a former youth leader that you cannot have a good event without good food, because otherwise people will just, it's like you fall the first hurdle. But having that kosher food and getting the proper kosher food delivered and was so important. And it became like a kind of, it was almost like a religious thing, of making, my responsibility to do that. And there were all sorts of moments like that. There were connective moments between the work and my background and my upbringing, my Habonim, because a lot of these are kibbutzniks. So I felt very, I really knew what they were talking about when they were talking about growing up in the kibbutz, where it was Be'eri or near Oz, where there was a proper socialist kibbutzim, just like we used to stay in when we were with Habonim. And all of that together, it was kind of, it's going to take me another decade to process all of that. So I know I'm not quite answering the original question, but how did I deal with shul in the past 2.5 years? It was really important and also like impossible to separate.
Yeah, Adam, I think you have expressed wonderfully too much to process as a way of looking beyond this physical world and our ethics and what we stand for and what it means to practice this Judaism, and especially in these desperate times, has come across really clearly. You've answered in spades to my mind. It's really been wonderful talking to you. I think of you as a Kiddush Hashem, as a sanctification of God's name, of bringing these ethical ideas into the public sphere and being a moral, upstanding citizen and religious person. It spreads that message so wonderfully. And it's been really interesting talking about your beliefs and looking at God. And may God bless you in all that you do, growing up your children, the open way you're educating them and your passion. You'll do, I know, many more things for the Jewish people and for the world. And things should be good for us and for the Jewish people. Thank you so much.
And thank you to you, Rafi, and thank you on behalf of all the people like me who have been inspired by your teachings and by LSJS over the years, which has been really important to my family anyway. Not quite my children yet, but maybe, maybe a bit later.
Please God. Thank you so much. That's very kind. Thank you.